Slapchop is the best way to paint Warhammer minis. But why? Well, let's put it to the test against some other methods and usher in the new era of Warhammer painting. The Slapchop method, popularized by the honest wargamer, is a combination of specific zenithal highlights and then utilizing contrast paints and their natural translucent nature to create natural shadows and highlights over the entire miniature in one smooth coat. Here are the main steps for the Slapchop method. You're going to prime in black, then you're going to do a zenithal in gray, then you're going to do a dry brush of white, and then you take your contrast paints of choice and slap it all over the miniature. Seems pretty easy, right? Well, why don't we put brush to mini and see if this method stacks up against the other preferred ways to paint Warhammer minis utilizing contrast paints. So I followed the steps of the Slapchop technique. Prime black, gray zenithal, white dry brush. Now the mini you're watching is actually my second attempt at Slapchop, because the first one I did, I was way too skimpy on the white dry brush, and the yellow honestly looked pretty terrible at. So just something to keep in mind if you're doing bright colors, like Imperial Fist Yellow, maybe go a little heavier handed on your white dry brush. I went in with my paintbrushes and started slapping contrast paint all over the mini. I chose Imperial Fist Yellow for the armor because I enjoy inflicting pain upon myself, and you can see how it covers over the black and gray sections. It just doesn't look quite right. It just honestly just looks more black than yellow, and overall it kind of loses that effect. But it does brighten up quite a bit on the white edges, and I think overall you could say that it gives a one coat shadow and highlight solution. One thing I want to note here, and this is not just a weakness of Slapchop, but really just a weakness of contrast paints in general, is that if you mess up and paint in an area where you don't want that paint to be, it honestly ruins all of your further steps, because contrast paint is inherently translucent. So if you accidentally paint some of your brown cloth where your yellow armor is supposed to be, you can't just paint more yellow over it because the brown is just going to show through no matter what. So in order to fix this, you either have to paint the whole section white or, black with gray with white, and then repaint your yellow onto it. So keep that in mind, that you really need strong brush control when utilizing contrast paints because of its translucent nature. It is inherently not beginner friendly. So what are my overall impressions of this Slapchop technique? Well, I will say during the painting process, I was pretty skeptical about how it would turn out. But once I finally finished the miniature, I was overall pretty impressed by it and not as scared as I was during the painting process. I think the Slapchop method works. However, like many other things, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution. If you plan on using more translucent contrast paints, such as Imperial Fist Yellow or Dark Oath Flesh, then I would recommend going much heavier on your white dry brush. Or you could potentially use another method, like the traditional white base coat that we're going to talk about coming up. So I wanted to compare and contrast this Slapchop technique against a couple other commonly used methods for utilizing contrast paint. One, through an airbrush, and two, over a white base coat, which I kind of consider to be the quote-unquote normal way of utilizing contrast paints and kind of their marketed method of putting them over contrast paints to get these, one coat shadows and highlights. So we're going to test out this technique against those two and kind of see how it stands up against these. Something I love about contrast paint is how easily it goes through an airbrush. It requires little to no thinning and just gives it a very smooth, opaque, bright coat of whatever contrast paint you're utilizing. I do suggest putting this over a white primer because remember, contrast paint's inherently translucent, and if you try to put it over black or gray, it does not look as good. However, a big fault of the airbrush method is that you don't get the natural highlights and shadows you do when painting it on with a brush. You have to go in and put all those shadows and highlights in with by hand by yourself. So something to keep in mind with this method. So the third and final method we're going to be testing out today to compare against this Slapchop method is what I would call the kind of standard normal method of utilizing contrast paints, which is over a all white base coat. This kind of naturally plays into the translucent nature of the contrast paints and kind of supposed to give you this marketed shadows and highlights in a one coat solution, similar to how the Slapchop method also markets itself, but in a much more, I would say, brighter fashion because it's an all white base coat. I actually find this method pretty useful, and I use it personally in painting miniatures myself quite frequently. However, you are at the hands of the quality of contrast paint, and let it be known that not all contrast paints are created equal. So it's probably best to play around and test out the contrast paints you want to use on maybe a test miniature or maybe some test pieces before slapping it all over your army, because I will utter this again, not all contrast paints are created equal. So, the ultimate question at hand here, is Slapchop the best technique to paint your Warhammer minis? And I will say, kind of. I don't think that the Slapchop method is perfect, but I also don't think the other two methods I utilize today are perfect either. I think that these methods all have a time and a place depending on the type of finished product you want. And I think it's up to you to decide what's going to work best for you. So I really think it kind of depends on what your goal is. What type of end product do you want it to look like? If you want a one coat solution that has very stark contrast of highlights and shadows, then I think that the Slapchop method might be the one for you. However, different types of contrast paints cover in different ways over this method. I found that Imperial Fist Yellow and the Dark Oath Flesh contrast paints just didn't really cover very well and look very good, but the more darker opaque contrast paints like Garagax Sewer or Bale Red, those ones covered very well. So I think it's important to maybe experiment with the contrast paints you want to utilize, because like I've said before, not all contrast paints are created equal, and they cover in different ways with this method. Moving forward, I think I will use a combination of both this Slapchop method and the more traditional method over an all-white base coat, kind of depending on the colors I'm utilizing. Like I just mentioned, certain paints don't cover as well over the Slapchop method, but the all-white base coat makes the miniature far more brighter. So if you're looking for a darker, grittier look, then the Slapchop method probably accomplishes that much better. So I think moving forward, I will use both techniques depending on the type of miniatures I want to produce and the type of goals I have for the look of that army. So I have shared my thoughts and opinions and my comparisons against other methods I've utilized, but let me know what you think. Have you tried the Slapchop method? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know down in the comments below. I'd like to hear what your opinion is on it, because I don't think it's the end-all be-all of one-coat solutions, but I do think it has its place in our hobby. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it so much. If you could, I'd really appreciate it if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. I just recently hit 100 subs, which is pretty exciting, as I've been doing this for about 3 months, and I've just been really happy with the success and the reception to the videos on the channel overall. So I really appreciate everyone who has subscribed up to this point, and for everyone else who will subscribe in the future. I really appreciate it. Of course, there's a bunch of links in the description of different ways to help support the channel and help me out. If you're interested, you can check all that out. But of course, and as always, elevate your game night.
You're gonna love my nuts.